I never thought that after so many years of a shared life, after so many mornings waking up beside the same man, I would reach the final stretch of our story and discover something he had kept hidden deep in his chest, something so secret that it seemed it would never see the light of day. I always believed I knew every line on his face, every secret in his gaze. I always thought that between us there were no mysteries, that our love was made only of simple truths and the affection that had survived the passing of years. Before I start, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing that my story is reaching different places, but life, that mischievous thing that never tires of laying surprises in our path, had other plans. It was in a time when he was already so sick he could hardly speak. The illness arrived slowly, first stealing his appetite, then the strength in his legs, until he found himself lying in that iron bed, breathing shallowly, his eyes always heavy with weariness. I would sit beside him, holding his hand, praying silently that God would ease his pain. Every night I would rise to adjust his pillow, to wet his lips with cool water, to tell him he was not alone. Even when he seemed far away, I kept talking to him, recounting the little things of the day, as if I feared that silence would be the first step of farewell. I would say that the hens were still laying eggs, that the roses in the yard were blooming, that the postman had passed without bringing any news. It was my way of keeping life going, even when everything around us seemed ready to leave. It was on one of those cold nights that I saw a different sadness in his eyes. It was not only the pain of his body, it was an old, deep pain that came from inside his soul. He took a deep breath, turned his face to me, and tried to speak, but his voice came so soft that I had to lean close to hear, and then I felt that something very big was about to be said. I cannot explain what goes through the heart of a woman who senses that her husband carries a secret. It is a fear that does not quite feel like fear. It is a tightness that starts in the chest and spreads to the hands. My heart was beating as if it wanted to warn me that this confession would change everything I thought I knew about our story. But even so, I took a deep breath and told him he could speak, that he need not be afraid. I promised I would listen calmly, whatever it was, and that was when he began to cry. Not a loud cry, but a silent weeping that slipped down the corner of his eyes and disappeared into the pillow. I passed my hand over his forehead and felt the warmth of remorse. He spent a long time unable to say anything. Only after many tries did he finally whisper that he needed to tell me about a child he had fathered outside our marriage. In that moment, it felt as if the ground opened beneath my feet. I froze, not knowing if I should cry, scream, or ask why. It had never crossed my mind that he could have hidden something like that. We had shared everything: the hard work, the poverty that visited us so many times, the joy when we bought our home. We raised our children with all we had to give, and I always believed there could be nothing so secret between us. I did not answer right away. I just sat there, holding his hand, looking at that so familiar face that suddenly seemed to belong to another man. Everything around me felt far away. The sound of the wind against the window, the creak of the bed, even my own breathing. It was as if I was outside my own life, watching it all unfold without being able to stop it. He kept crying, repeating that he was sorry, that he had never found the courage to tell me. He said he had done everything wrong, that he feared losing my trust. I wanted to ask who that child was, where he was, if he was already a grown man or still a boy. I wanted to ask if he had ever thought of telling me, if he remembered that child on the nights when we lay side by side. But no words came to my mouth. In that moment, I realized that old age does not spare us sorrow, that no matter how much we think we have seen everything, life can still surprise us. I felt a sadness so deep, I thought my heart would not bear it, but along with it came a strange compassion, because I could see he was truly remorseful, and that this secret weighed more than any illness. I stayed there until daylight, holding his hand and knowing that, in some way, my world would never be the same again. I did not yet know if I could forgive. I did not know if this would become a wound that would never close. But in that moment, I knew he needed me to listen, and that was what I did. When I close my eyes and go back in time, I can still remember the day I first saw his face. It was a clear afternoon, one of those days when the sky seems endless. I was a young woman, my heart full of dreams, believing that nothing was impossible. He arrived in our town riding a bay horse, wearing a hat worn on the brim and a smile that looked like it wanted to conquer the whole world. I do not know if it was destiny or mere chance, but as soon as our eyes met, I felt that my life would never be the same again. In those days, people were not in such a hurry as they are now. Courtship began with a conversation at the gate. With an embroidered handkerchief, a girl let fall just to see if the young man would stoop to pick it up. That was how it happened with us. He would come at dusk, when the eucalypt shadow grew long, bringing a bundle of honey candies he bought at old Mr. Maneko's shop. I used to say he did not need to spend money on me, but inside my heart melted every time he showed up with that small kindness. The neighbors started to whisper that I had an eye on the stranger. I pretended not to hear, but whenever he passed on the street, my face burned like hot coals. My mother, a serious woman of few words, watched everything in silence. Until one day, when she saw me looking out the window, she said a woman's heart sometimes chooses difficult roads. I did not fully understand what she meant. I only knew that by his side I felt a joy that had no explanation. When he came to ask for my hand, my father invited him to sit in the parlor on a wooden bench that creaked with every movement. I stayed in the kitchen, my ear pressed to the door, trying to guess what they were saying. My heart was beating so loud I thought it might leap out of my chest. After a long silence, I heard my father say that a man of his word must prove his worth before taking a daughter away. And he, without faltering, promised he would give me a decent life, even if it was a simple one. The engagement was celebrated on a Sunday after Mass. My mother lent me a white dress that once belonged to her. I wore it with such care, it felt like touching something sacred. When I walked to the church door, he was waiting with that calm smile he always had. That smile told me that even if the world fell apart, I would have a place to rest my weariness. Life as husband and wife began in a small shack at the back of a dirt road. It was only one room, a kitchen, and a yard full of weeds, but it was there that I learned what it meant to be a woman in truth, to rise early, light the fire, strain the coffee, wash the clothes in a basin. It was never an easy task, but I never complained, because each day by his side had a meaning I could not have found alone. At first, he would come home with calloused hands, but he always brought a handful of stories to share while I prepared supper. I listened, laughing at his embellishments, and thought that no misfortune would ever be too big if we stayed together. Those were poor days, but full of hope. I believed that little by little, life would improve. When our first children were born, everything grew tighter, but also more beautiful. I remember how he held each child in his arms, with the care of someone cradling treasure. In those days, I believed there was no secret in his heart beyond the worry of putting food on the table. It never crossed my mind there could be another life outside ours, another bond, another child. On Sundays, after Mass, we would sit on the porch watching time pass by. He would say it was there, on that simple bench, that he felt peace. I would rest my head on his shoulder and close my eyes, certain that nothing would be lacking if we remained together. Little did I know that even when you think you know everything about a person, there can still be a hidden peace that only reveals itself in the end. As years passed, the house grew. We built an extra room, bought a new table, planted rose bushes along the fence. Every achievement came slowly, the fruit of much effort. We never had luxury, but we had what mattered: respect, companionship, and the tenderness you do not learn in any book. I believed our love had no cracks, that our story was simple, without detours, that the trust we shared was whole. And so I never looked for signs of anything else, never questioned long absences or longer silences. Perhaps it was innocence, or perhaps too much faith in his character. Or perhaps it was simply the way I was raised, to believe first and doubt later. Today, thinking of all we lived, I know there was truth, there was sincere affection, but there was also a secret. And that secret slept for many, many years, like the seed of a bitter plant that only sprouts when time decides. And that is why, when he told me in that hospital bed, the pain came so deep, because it was as if I discovered our story had never been only ours. There was a part he had kept to himself, a part I never knew, and it changed everything I thought I understood about the man I chose to walk beside. When I think carefully, I see there was always something in him I could never quite reach. It was not coldness nor contempt. It was a silence that lived deep in his eyes and, now and again, showed itself when he thought I was not noticing. He had this way of staring off into the distance, as if seeing a memory he did not want to share. I was used to watching him tell stories, laughing loudly, embellishing tales from his youth. But after those moments, there nearly always came a pause when he withdrew into himself. He would sit there on the porch bench or at the edge of the bed, hands clasped, head bowed, as if carrying a weight with no name. I remember one night in particular. It was shortly after we had our second child. The house was still small and life was hard. I was busy hemming a bedsheet by the light of a lantern, and he was too quiet. I asked if he was ill. He denied it, without lifting his face. I pressed him, saying he could trust me. He simply answered there were things in life no man knew how to explain. Then he changed the subject, as if closing the door to a room he would not let me see. At the time, I did not think much of it. I blamed it on worry over our debts, the hard work, his father's failing health. I believed it was all just weariness, because we always find some reason that lets us believe everything is fine. But today, looking back, I see that silence was something else. It was the silence of someone hiding a secret. I simply did not want to see it, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of too much love, because loving is also this, making up excuses not to look at what hurts. He had this habit of disappearing inside his own head. Sometimes it was early morning while he drank his coffee. I saw his gaze fixed on something that was neither the kitchen nor the yard. It stayed on a point only he knew. I would say something, and he took a moment to answer, as if returning from far away. When he realized I was watching, he covered it with a smile and changed the subject. Other times, he got up in the middle of the night and sat on the bed's edge. I pretended to sleep, but heard his sigh, heavy as if he bore the whole world on his shoulders. I wanted to ask what it was, but I was afraid to hear an answer I could not endure, so I just closed my eyes tighter and prayed softly. There were occasions when he came home later than usual, saying he had stopped at the shop or gone to help a friend. I believed him. I was never one to doubt. I always thought trust was the cement that kept our house standing. But now, looking back, maybe I believed because I needed to, because if I did not trust, everything we had built would lose its meaning. When he was well, he was a cheerful man, full of energy. He liked to sit with neighbors, talking until night came. At those times, I watched him and thought I was lucky to have such a lively companion. But as soon as everyone left, when it was just the two of us, he turned solemn again. It was as if the presence of others distracted the memory he kept, and in the quiet of our home, it came back whole. I used to wonder what lived in his heart. Was he thinking of some old sorrow? Did he regret something he had done? I never knew, and he never told me. Over time, I learned to live with it. It was like a shadow that followed us, but never showed its true shape. Some days, I wanted to shake that silence, to tell him he could share everything with me, that I would not judge him. But courage always failed me, because deep down, I feared that whatever truth he held would change who I was, change our love. I thought that if we pretended there was nothing wrong, maybe time would carry that silence away. But time does not carry everything. Some things it only hides until it cannot anymore. And so I lived beside him, between true laughter and silences that left my chest tight. I loved that man. I never doubted that. And I think he loved me too. But there was a part of him that never belonged to me, a part he kept locked away. Only years later, in the hospital bed, did I understand. It was in that silence that the secret of the child he fathered outside our marriage lived. That was why he looked into the distance. That was why he sometimes cried, without saying why. I only understood too late, when there was nothing left for me to do. But listen, it was in a long winter that his health began to wither, like a leaf losing its green before its time. I was never a woman who paid much mind to complaints, but this time I could see it was not just weariness. First, he stopped eating with any appetite. His plate would remain half full, and I pretended not to see, hoping it would pass. Then came a dry cough that would not go away, not with guaco tea, nor with the syrup the neighbor taught me to make. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of that cough cutting through the house's silence. Each time he coughed, my chest tightened, as if God himself was warning me that something serious was near. But stubborn as I was, I kept telling myself it would improve. I always thought that those who worked hard did not have time to fall ill. How wrong I was. He began to grow thin. First, His trousers hung loose. Then even his face lost its fullness. The strong man who used to carry sacks of corn on his shoulder, who fixed the roof without complaint, grew small inside his own clothes. I could see it, but I had no courage to say aloud that I was afraid. Because when you name the illness, it feels as if you make it stronger. In the afternoons, he sat on the porch chair, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the street in silence. I would ask if he wanted something to eat. He would shake his head slowly, as if he no longer had hunger even for words. Sometimes I sat beside him and held his hand. It was the only way I knew to say I was there, that he was not alone. The neighbors began to notice. They came to ask if we needed help, if we had already called the doctor. I told them he was only weak, that soon he would be better. But inside, I knew it was not true. I felt that this winter would not be like the others. When at last I accepted that we could not pretend anymore, I sent for the village doctor. He came on a cold morning, carrying his black case and a serious face. I asked him to examine my husband carefully. I stood there against the wall, watching the doctor open his shirt, listen to his chest, measure his fever. That was when my knees weakened, because I saw in the doctor's eyes the same fear that lived in my heart. After the exam, he asked me to step outside with him into the yard. I went, my heart beating wildly. He said the situation was delicate, that we must take him to the hospital in town, that at home there would be no help. I wanted to weep, but I swallowed the tears. I went back inside and found my husband trying to smile. He said there was no need for a hospital, that he would soon be well, but his eyes could not hold up that lie. The next day, I packed a small bag with some clothes, the rosary he always left on the bedside table, and a warmer blanket. I called our eldest son to help me lift him onto the cart. He did not protest. He only lowered his eyes, as if saying goodbye before the hour. As we passed through the gate, I felt we were leaving behind not just our house, but the life as we had known it. The trip to the hospital was long. The cold wind blew against his face, and I held his hand the whole time. Sometimes he closed his eyes and breathed slowly, as if he were saving what strength remained. I sat there, repeating softly that everything would be fine, though I no longer believed much in my own words. We arrived as the evening fell. The nurses came with a stretcher. When I saw him lying there, so small, so pale, I felt a sorrow I cannot explain. It was as if part of me fell ill as well. The days in the hospital were all alike. I arrived early, sat by the bed and stayed there, holding his hand, changing damp cloths, adjusting his pillow. Sometimes he opened his eyes and tried to smile. Other times, he stared at the ceiling, as if speaking to someone no one else could see. It was during that time he began to speak of things I did not understand. Sometimes he said strange names. Sometimes he would cry all at once, as if remembering some old sin. I tried to ask, but he closed his eyes and fell silent. I saw that the illness was not only in the body, it was in the soul too. A fever of remorse that burned him from within. And I, there, could do nothing except give him my presence. That was how the days passed. And I came to understand that no matter how much I wished it, I could not protect him from everything. Not from the sickness, not from the regrets. The only thing left to me was to stay, and stay I did. The last days I spent by his side were made of small conversations, the kind one fears to forget. I knew he was leaving slowly, like a flame that dies without fuss. So I always sat very close, so I would not miss any whisper that escaped his lips. It was strange to see that man, who had once been so full of vigor, speak in such a soft voice, almost vanished. Yet every word he spoke felt heavier than a stone. Sometimes he would begin telling old stories. I closed my eyes and listened. He spoke of the day he arrived in the town, of the horse he bought with his first earnings, of our wedding. It was as if he wished to visit again all we had been, like someone tidying the house before leaving. There was one afternoon when he held my hand so long, my fingers went numb. Even so, I did not want to let go. In that moment, he said that if he could go back, he would have done some things differently. His voice was hoarse, but there was no anger, only sorrow. I felt he was weighing every memory, and some hurt more than others. One day he called me by my full name, something he had not done since we were young. He looked into my eyes and said he had always wished me well, that no matter what wrong he had done, my face had always been his comfort. I wanted to answer that I knew it, but my throat closed. I stayed silent, holding back the thick sob that rose, and only nodded. In the nights, when the fever brought delirium, he spoke names I did not recognize. Sometimes he called for a woman, sometimes for a child. I asked who they were, but he gave no answer. He shut his eyes and turned his face, as if he did not wish to explain. I passed a cool cloth over his brow, feeling that there was a part of his story that was never mine. It was as if I cared for someone who, deep down, had always kept another life. But there were moments of clarity. In those hours, he asked my forgiveness. He did not say for what, only repeated that he was sorry, that he never had the courage to open his heart entirely. I saw he was fighting both the body's fatigue and the weight of conscience. That was how I came to understand that regret can make a person sicker than any illness. One night, the moonlight came through the window, leaving the room pale and clear. I sat beside him, my hand resting over his chest, feeling his heart beating weak. Then he told me he needed to say something before God took him. A chill ran along my spine. I knew that moment would come, but I was not ready. No one ever is. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and began to speak with difficulty. He said that many years ago, he made a mistake, that he met another woman, and that from that encounter, a child was born. When I heard it, my whole body seemed to turn cold. I tried to see if it was fever's delirium, but when he opened his eyes, he was more lucid than ever. I stood silent, as if I had forgotten how to speak. He cried, and in his weeping there was a sorrow I could never measure. He said he had always wanted to tell me but was afraid of losing my trust, afraid of destroying the house we built together. I wanted to scream that he had already destroyed everything in that instant, but no scream came, only a heavy silence, larger than any word. He asked me to forgive him, to understand that, even with this sin, the love he had for me was true. I could not answer. I only lowered my head and felt a sadness too big to fit in my chest, a deep sorrow made of both hurt and compassion. In the days that followed, he spoke little. The illness advanced, and his strength slipped away. But every time he opened his eyes, he seemed to search for my face. And I was always there, because despite everything, I could not abandon him. I stayed until the end, holding his hand, gathering every last word, because even if I would never forget that revelation, I could not forget all that he had been to me. And so were our last conversations, words that became a wound, but also brought a kind of peace. For somehow I felt he needed to confess before he left, and only after he opened that secret could he finally rest. I always thought that after a certain age, nothing could truly surprise us anymore, that life would grow gentle, without great upheavals, like a river that flows calmly until it meets the sea. But that night, sitting at the edge of his bed, I understood there are truths that can change everything, even when your hair is white and your heart is tired. The room was quiet. Only the sound of his breathing could be heard, weak, like wind slipping through a crack. The kerosene lamp cast a trembling light that made the walls seem even more lonely. My hand rested over his, feeling the warm, damp skin. From time to time, he opened his eyes, but soon closed them again, as if he no longer had strength to hold a gaze. I thought that night would be just like the others. I would sit there, keeping vigil, praying softly that God might ease his suffering. But then he slowly turned his face, pressed my hand with a surprising strength, and called me by my maiden name. It had been so long since anyone had spoken it that my heart raced, as if I were young again. His voice came out hoarse, as if tearing through his throat. He said he did not wish to leave carrying such a heavy burden. I did not know what to say. I only caressed his face, trying with that gesture to tell him I was there, ready to listen, even if I did not quite understand what was coming. Then he began to speak. Every word seemed to cost him enormous effort. He said that many years before we married, he met a woman in a neighboring town. I felt a chill run up my spine, but I did not let go of his hand. He told me it had been just once, a night that should never have happened. That afterward, he returned to his life and believed he would never hear of her again. I did not breathe. My chest tightened as if my body could not fit on that chair. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and then confessed that from that night, a child was born. When I heard that word, everything inside me seemed to collapse. A child, an entire life I had never known existed. I stayed silent. No tears came right away. I could only look at him, searching his face for any sign of a lie, any proof it was fever's delirium. But it was not. I saw in his expression the pain of someone finally speaking a sin he had carried so long. He said he tried to forget, believed it was better to keep silent, that he feared losing my trust, feared staining the story we had built together, and so he chose silence. But now, at the edge of death, he did not wish the secret to be buried with him. He wanted me to know the truth, even if it hurt. I could not ask a single question. I did not wish to know the woman's name, nor where that child was. In that moment, all I felt was a mixture of hurt and compassion. Hurt that he had hidden it. Compassion to see him so broken, so regretful, so small inside his sorrow. He wept. I had never seen that man cry like that. It was not the weeping of someone asking for forgiveness, hoping to be absolved. It was the sob of someone who had lost everything, even the hope of being forgiven. I wanted to speak, but no words came, so I only ran my hand through his hair, almost all white, and closed my eyes to hold back my tears. In that instant, I understood that love is not made only of happy moments. True love is also this bitter part, this pain without a name, this wound we must decide whether to tend or let fester. I did not know if I could forgive, but I knew that if someday I could, it would be because I still loved him, despite everything. He spent the rest of the night in silence. When morning came, he opened his eyes and looked for me with a tired gaze. I felt he was at peace for having confessed, and in a way, that brought me some relief too, because I preferred to know, even late, rather than live deceived until the end. That morning, I left the room and walked down the hospital corridor on unsteady legs. I sat on a wooden bench, buried my face in my hands, and cried everything that had stayed trapped inside me. It was a long, sorrowful weeping, but necessary, because only afterward could I breathe again. And that was the unexpected confession that changed my story, a truth that came when it seemed too late, but needed to be told, even if it cost dearly, even if it could never be forgotten. After he finished speaking, I no longer knew who I was. I sat there in that cane chair, hands resting in my lap, my eyes lost on some spot on the wall. It felt as if time had stopped, as if the clock on the wall had grown tired of marking the hours. He was breathing with difficulty, and all I could think was that everything I had believed, everything I had defended my whole life, had turned to dust. I did not cry right away. I think my heart was so astonished it did not know whether it hurt or was simply empty. His confession was not just a story from another time. It was a wound opening in the middle of our present, tearing apart everything we had stitched together. I always thought that if he ever hurt me this way, I would stand up and leave, that I would have the courage to turn my back, to slam the door. But there, seeing that man so weak, so sick, I could not take a single step. His face looked different. It held a defeated expression I had never seen. He did not try to defend himself. He did not say it had been just a small lapse. He did not swear that he loved me more than life itself. He just lay there, his eyes wet, accepting my pain as someone who knows he has already lost. I thought of our children, the house we built with so much effort, the mornings I rose before the sun to prepare coffee and set life in order. I thought of the nights I waited for him to return from work, of the talks we shared at the bedside, of the way he called me his old lady with that tired smile. All of it seemed so far away, so small beside what I had just heard. I felt shame. Shame for having believed I knew every corner of his heart. Shame for having trusted with my eyes closed. I was always a woman of my word, of faith. I always said marriage was a sacred commitment. And in that moment, I found myself doubting even my own memory, asking whether he had ever thought of telling me, or whether he preferred to keep the secret so he would not have to face the shame. When at last I managed to lift my eyes, I saw his gaze fixed on the ceiling. It seemed he could not bear to look at me. Perhaps he knew I was no longer the same woman as minutes before, and I was not, because when a truth like that comes, it tears away your innocence. It leaves only a cold emptiness in its place. I did not scream. I did not make a scene. I said not a single word. It was as if my voice had stayed out there, in the hospital corridor. Inside, there was a whirlwind of questions. Where was that child? Did he have his face? Had he grown up knowing who his father was? Had he ever thought of seeking news? But I did not ask anything, because I knew I did not have the strength to hear any more answers. Hours passed, and he fell asleep. I stayed sitting, my back straight and my soul curled up. I felt such a deep longing for the time when I believed our love was whole, without cracks, longing for the woman I had been, the one who looked at him with blind trust. That woman had died there, in that dawn. Outside, the day began to lighten. The sound of roosters reached through the cracks in the window. I felt the world kept turning, even though mine had stopped. That was when I cried. I cried without making a sound, letting the tears run down my chin to dampen my apron. It was a quiet weeping, from someone who knows there is no use fighting what cannot be undone. Deep in my heart, I knew he was not only that mistake, he was also all the kindness, all the moments of care, all the struggles we shared. But it was hard to remember that just then. The hurt was greater than any good memory, and I was in no hurry to forgive, in no hurry to understand. I only wanted to breathe and sit there until I could find some scrap of peace inside myself. That was how my world fell apart, without a scream, without a witness, just me, him, and the truth that came too late. In the days that came after that confession, I became another woman. It was as if I walked through life with a veil over my eyes. I did what needed to be done. I cared for him, changed the water in the clay jug, straightened the sheets. But inside, everything was suspended, without ground. When he slept, I would sit staring at the ceiling. It was in those moments the questions came. They arrived one after the other, like a procession of restless souls. Who was that woman? Had it been love, or just a mistake? Did he ever see her again? Where was that child? Had he inherited that same way of furrowing his brow when he thought? Did he have that crooked half-smile? I remembered all the years I spent by his side, believing I was his only story. And now I discovered there had been another life in parallel, one I never touched, one he never had the courage to tell me about. It was as if my story were an embroidered cloth that suddenly revealed a tear on the underside, and no matter how I wished, I did not know how to mend that gap. Sometimes he would wake and call me. His voice was so faint I had to come close to understand. He would ask for water, ask me to pray for him. I did everything without complaint, but inside, I felt a distance I cannot describe. Part of me wanted to ask everything, to have him tell me the details, to explain why he had done such a thing. But another part was afraid to hear things that would hurt more than the silence. So I kept quiet. I only answered with a nod, with a touch on his white hair, and the questions kept throbbing in my mind, like a thorn that cannot be pulled out. Did he think of that child when he looked at our boys sleeping? Did he feel guilt on birthdays, on Christmases when we gathered the family? Did he ever imagine this secret would come to light one day? The hardest part was having no one to share that burden with. I could not tell anyone. The children would look at me with pity, perhaps with anger toward him. The neighbors would whisper at every corner. And I, who had always been a respected woman, did not want my home to become the talk of others. So I kept everything inside. In the loneliness of the nights, I thought of that child's face, who by then must have been a grown man. Where was he? Did he know who his father was? Had he grown up feeling the absence of an embrace he never received? Each question struck like a blade, and none had an answer. There were nights when I almost wished he would wake clear-minded, just so he could tell me everything. But when he opened his eyes, I saw so much sorrow there that my courage faded. I did not wish to torture him. I did not wish to torture myself more than I already was. So I only sat beside him, holding his hand, and waited for time to pass. One day, a nurse asked if I was all right. I smiled, the way one smiles when they do not wish their pain to show, and I said I was. But inside, I was only weariness and confusion, because not knowing is a wound that aches slowly. It is a pain that eats away, like water beating always on the same place. When I think of those days, I feel I was divided in two. The woman who kept caring for him tenderly, and the woman who carried a sea of questions that would never be answered. It was that second woman who robbed me of sleep. I tried to pray, but even the prayers seemed to get stuck in my throat. I know many would say I should have demanded explanations, that I should have made him speak everything, down to the last detail. But I did not have the courage, because the full truth can be crueler than the silence. And I was already hurt enough. So those days passed, my heart heavy with doubts. And deep inside, I knew some questions would follow me until the end of my life. Because there are things no one can answer. There are questions only God knows the reply to. And perhaps it was better that way. I always thought forgiveness was something simple, that it was enough to want it, and the heart would be light again. But I learned it is not so. Forgiveness is a long road, full of stones that bruise your feet. Sometimes it takes so long to arrive, you lose hope of ever finding it. After that confession, I spent many nights awake, my gaze lost in the weak light of the lamp. While he slept, I would recall every small moment we had shared. His first smile, the day he asked me to marry him, the joy on his face when our children were born. All of that mixed with the pain of the lie he carried for so long. In the beginning, I could feel nothing but hurt. It was as if my chest were filled with a dark weight, leaving no room for anything else. I did not want to speak or eat. I only wanted to understand how someone who had always sworn loyalty could have built another story, however small, beyond my sight. There was a dawn when I thought of leaving. I got up, tied my hair back, and looked at the door. I thought of going home, of leaving him there with his guilt. But when I came near the bed, I saw his pale face, marked by suffering. I saw how shallow his breathing was, how his eyes moved under the lids, and I realized it was not courage I felt, it was escape, because abandoning him in that moment would not make me stronger. It would only make me resemble the part of him that had hurt me. So I took a deep breath and sat again. That was when I understood that forgiveness is not a gift you give the other. It is a gift you give yourself, because to keep resentment is to carry poison in your blood, and I was too old to poison myself any longer. In the days that followed, I began trying to see everything with gentler eyes. Yes, he had done wrong. He had denied me a truth I deserved, but he had also given me so many years of companionship. I knew I could not erase a piece of the story without erasing the rest, and despite all the pain, I did not wish to forget everything we had built. There was a morning when he woke clear-headed for a moment. He looked at me with tired eyes and said he did not deserve my care. I answered that it was not about deserving. I was there because it was the right thing, because even hurt, I had not stopped loving. In that moment, I saw that a part of forgiveness already lived inside me, even if I did not yet know its name. The way to complete forgiveness was slow. I had to relearn how to remember him without pain. I had to accept that no one is only the good they do, nor only the wrong they commit. We are all a mixture, like bread dough with flour and yeast. If I wished to move on with any peace, I needed to accept our story had flaws, and that I was not obliged to forget, but could choose not to let it destroy me. I prayed a lot. I asked God to teach me to be bigger than my pride, to give me gentleness, to endure his last days without hatred in my heart. And little by little, I felt the bitterness lose strength. In its place grew a quiet sadness, the kind you carry without fuss, only to remind you that you too are fragile. On the last Sunday before he left, I sat by the bed and spoke of our wedding. I told him of St. Anthony's festivals, of our rides in the cart, of the children running through the yard. He listened with a nearly invisible smile, and I realized that remembering was not only nostalgia, it was also a way to give thanks for the beautiful things we had, even if they were not perfect. When he squeezed my hand, I felt there was true remorse in it, and perhaps that helped me forgive, because there was nothing he could do anymore to repair the past. What remained was only the choice not to let the pain grow larger than the memory of our love. I do not know if I ever forgave completely. Perhaps true forgiveness is something only God understands. But I know that in that last week, I managed to care for him with real tenderness. I managed to look at his face and remember that despite everything, he was the man who shared life with me. And that alone already asked for some form of peace. The last days he had were so quiet, it seemed time itself had stopped around his bed. I arrived early, when the sun was only beginning to brighten the hospital courtyard, and I sat in the same cane chair that creaked every time I moved. I stayed there, holding his hand, watching his chest rise and fall slowly, as if every breath were borrowed. I knew he would never return home again. The doctor did not have to tell me. Deep in the soul, you feel when it is time to say goodbye. But still, every day I rose with hope. Perhaps it was only habit, or perhaps it was that stubbornness one grows after living so many years beside someone. The nurses looked at me with sorrow in their eyes. They brought me warm coffee, placed their hands on my shoulder, asked if I needed anything. I always answered no. What I needed, no one could give me. I only wished for more time, Just a few more days to stay there, feeling the warmth of his hand before everything faded. One afternoon he woke a little. He opened his eyes slowly and searched for me. When he found me, he tried a smile so small it barely lifted the corner of his mouth. I smiled back, even though my chest hurt as it never had. He moved his lips, as if wanting to say something, but no voice came. I leaned close, laid my ear on his chest, and felt that his heart beat so faintly it seemed about to give up. I told him I was there, that he did not have to be afraid. I said he could rest, that God was already preparing a place of peace for him. And as I spoke, my tears fell onto the sheet, but I did not bother to wipe them, because it was a crying that needed to exist, a crying that came from the depths of everything we had been together. That night, the moon shone fully through the window. The white light made the room look different. I sat very near the bed, held his hand with both of mine, and prayed in silence. I asked Our Lady to receive him with kindness, to forgive his sins and ease his fears. While I prayed, I felt a different peace fill me. It was as if God was telling me I had done all I could, and that the rest was no longer in my hands. He lay still for many hours, breathing so slowly I sometimes thought he had already left. Then, when dawn arrived, I saw he opened his eyes one last time. He looked straight into mine, and for an instant, I recognized the man who once asked me to marry him under the fig tree. He pressed my hand, so softly it felt like a breath. Then, without any fuss, he let out the air and did not draw another. I do not know how long I stayed there, holding that hand that was already growing cold. It was as if my whole body had turned to stone. Outside, I heard the rooster crow and knew the day was beginning. But inside me there was only silence. A great, ancient silence, full of all the memories that now were only mine. When the nurse came in and saw he was gone, she laid a hand on my shoulder and said, I was a strong woman. I did not answer, because in that moment, I was not strong. I was only someone who had loved deeply, and who now had to learn to live with the emptiness. I stood slowly, passed my hand over his hair, and whispered that he could go in peace. I told him that despite everything, he had been my companion, that our love had been greater than any mistake, and that I no longer held bitterness, only a longing I knew would never pass. That morning, when I left the hospital, I felt that life had changed its color. The sky was clear, people walked along the street as if nothing had happened, but I carried inside me a new silence, a loneliness that only those who have lost understand, and at the same time, a gratitude for having had the courage to stay until the end. Because to love is also this, not to abandon, even when it hurts, even when your heart is broken. I knew he had departed with my forgiveness, and that, in the end, was all I had left to give. The days that followed after he passed were the strangest of my life. I would return home with slow steps, like someone who no longer knows where her own place is. The door creaked as always. The smell of coffee in the morning was the same, but everything seemed a little colorless. I woke before the sun, sat on the porch bench, and stayed there listening to the silence he left behind. At first, I thought that loneliness would drive me mad. I looked at the empty bed, at the chair where he sat in the evenings, and it felt as if there was a piece of me gone forever. But little by little, I began to see that pain, no matter how deep, was also proof that I had lived something real. Only those who have truly loved feel such longing. I began to remember him not only for the mistake he made, but for all that was good. I recalled the way he laughed when the grandchildren ran through the yard, the care he took with me on cold nights, the effort he made to see that we never lacked anything. Even when the memory of his secret returned, I could already take a deep breath and think that he had been a man like any other, full of good deeds, but also of weaknesses. In time, the visits came. The children started to come more often. Perhaps afraid I might be too sad. Each had their own way of showing care. Some came and spoke little, others held me in long embraces. I did not tell them about the child he had. I did not think it was the time. I did not think it fit to stir that story again. I understood there are secrets that only God needs to know fully, and that we carry inside us some truths that lose their power to hurt when we choose not to feed them. That choice was my greatest lesson, because I always thought forgiveness was the same as forgetting, but it is not. It is remembering without letting bitterness rule your heart. Today, When I sit at the bedside as night falls, I like to think he taught me more than he ever imagined. He taught me that to love is not to be sure. It is to choose to stay, even when disappointment knocks on the door. He taught me that life is not a straight story. It has curves, stumbles, new beginnings. If someone asks whether I would do it all again, I do not know how to answer. Perhaps if I could, I would have demanded he tell me the truth earlier. Perhaps I would have wept less if I had known sooner. But I also think that if life were perfect, we would learn nothing. It was in the hardest part that I discovered the woman I was. Strong, patient, capable of holding the hand of the one who hurt me, and still wishing him peace as he left. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see his gaze that last dawn. It was not the gaze of a man only guilty. It was the gaze of someone who loved, but who did not always know how to do right. That gaze remains with me, as memory and as warning. No one is only what they do wrong. Today, longing does not cut me as it once did. It is a gentle longing that comes slowly and makes me give thanks. Thanks for having loved, for having been loved, even if not in the perfect way I dreamed in my youth. Thanks for having had the courage to forgive. I do not know where the child he had is. Perhaps one day I will find out. Perhaps not. But if he exists and comes to find me, he will find only calm. Because after all, I learned that the heart can grow wide enough to hold even the stories we did not choose to live. When my hour comes, I wish to leave with that quiet in my chest. The certainty that I did not let hatred harden me, that I did not let resentment keep me from looking back with respect. I want my children and grandchildren to know that to love is always a risk, but it is the risk that makes life worthwhile. And if someone asks what remained, I will say that love remained. Even full of flaws, delays, and silences, love remained, and it is stronger than any lie. If you liked Grandma's story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can hear more stories like this and share them with other people who might be inspired by this story of overcoming. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been in a similar situation? How did you react? A kiss on the heart from all of you, and until the next story.